it chapter by chapter, one bite at a time. So many adventures and mountains we can climb. Take it word for word, line by line, one bite at a time.
Welcome to Bite at a Time Books, where we read you your favorite classics one bite at a time. My name is Bree Carlile, and I love to read, and wanted to share my passion with listeners like you. If you want to know what's coming next and vote on upcoming books, sign up for our newsletter at biteatatimebooks.com. You'll also find our new t-shirts in the shop, including podcast shirts and quote shirts from your favorite classic novels. Be sure to follow my show on your favorite podcast platform so you get all the new episodes. You can find most of our links in the show notes. But also our website, biteatatimebooks.com, includes all of the links for our show, including to our Patreon to support the show, and YouTube, where we have special behind the narration of the episodes. We're part of the Bite at a Time Books Productions Network. If you'd also like to hear what inspired your favorite classic authors to write their novels, and what was going on in the world at the time, check out the Bite at a Time Books Behind the Story podcast, wherever you listen to podcasts. Please note, while we try to keep the text as close to the original as possible, some words have been changed to honor the marginalized communities who've identified the words as harmful, and to stay in alignment with Bite at a Time Books' brand values. Today we'll be continuing Adventures of Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain. Chapter 23. Well, all day, him and the king was hard at it, rigging up a stage and a curtain and a row of candles for footlights. And that night the house was jam full of men in no time. When the place couldn't hold no more, the Duke he quit tending door and went around the back way and come onto the stage and stood up before the curtain and made a little speech, and praised up this tragedy and said it was the most thrillingest one that ever was. And so he went on bragging about the tragedy and about Edmund Kean the Elder, which was to play the main principal part in it. And at last, when he'd got everybody's expectations up high enough, he rolled up the curtain, and the next minute the king come a-prancing out on all fours, naked. And he was painted all over, ring-streaked and striped, all sorts of colors, as splendid as a rainbow. But never mind the rest of his outfit. It was just wild, but it was awful funny. The people most killed themselves laughing, and when the king got done capering and capered off behind the scenes, they roared and clapped and stormed and ha-ha'd till he'd come back and done it over again. And after that, they made him do it another time. Well, it would make a cow laugh to see the shines that old idiot cut. Then the Duke, he lets the curtain down, and bows to the people and says the great tragedy will be performed only 2 nights more on accounts of pressing London engagements, where the seats is all sold already for it in Drury Lane. And then he makes them another bow and says if he has succeeded in pleasing them and instructing them, he'll be deeply obliged if they'll mention it to their friends and get them to come and see it. 20 people sings out, "What? Is it over? Is that all?" The Duke says yes. Then there was a fine time. Everybody sings out, "Sold," and rose up mad, and was a-going for that stage and them tragedians, but a big, fine-looking man jumps up on a bench and shouts, "Hold on, just a word, gentlemen." They stopped to listen. "We're sold, mighty badly sold. But we don't want to be the laughing stock of this whole town, I reckon, and never hear the last of this thing as long as we live. No, what we want is to go out of here quiet and talk of this show up and sell the rest of the town. Then we'll all be in the same boat. Ain't that sensible?" "You bet it is. The judge is right," everybody sings out. "All right then, not a word about any sell. Go along home and advise everybody to come and see the tragedy." Next day you couldn't hear nothing around that town but how splendid that show was. House was jammed again that night, and we sold this crowd the same way. When me and the king and the Duke got home to the raft, we all had a supper, and by and by about midnight they made Jim and me back her out and float her down the middle of the river and fetch her in and hide her out about 2 miles below town. A third night the house was crammed again, and they weren't newcomers this time. but people that was at the show the other 2 nights. I stood by the Duke at the door, and I see that every man that went in had his pockets bulging or something muffled up under his coat. And I see it weren't no perfumery neither, not by a long sight. I smelled sickly eggs by the barrel and rotten cabbages and such things. And if I know the signs of a dead cat being around, and I bet I do, there was 64 of them went in. I shoved in there for a minute, but it was too various for me. I couldn't stand it. Well, when the place couldn't hold no more people, the Duke he give a fellow a quarter and told him to tend door for him for a minute, and then he started around for the stage door. I after him. But the minute we turned to the corner and was in the dark, he says, "Walk fast now till you get away from the houses and then shin for the raft like the Dickens was after you." I done it and he done the same. We struck the raft at the same time, and in less than 2 seconds we was gliding downstream, all dark and still and edging towards the middle of the river. Nobody sang a word. I reckoned the poor king was in for a gaudy time of it with the audience, but nothing of the sort. Pretty soon he crawls out from under the wigwam and says, "Well, how'd the old thing pan out this time, Duke?" He hadn't been uptown at all. We never showed a light till we was about 10 mile below the village. Then we lit up and had a supper, and the king and the Duke fairly laughed their bones loose over the way they'd served them people. The Duke says, "Greenhorns, flatheads. I knew the first house would keep mum and let the rest of the town get roped in. And I knew they'd lay for us the 3rd night and consider it was their turn now. Well, it is their turn, and I'd give something to know how much they'd take for it. I would just like to know how they're putting in their opportunity. They can turn it into a picnic if they want to. They brought plenty provisions." Them rapscallions took in $465 in that 3 nights. I never see money hauled in by the wagon load like that before. By and by, when they was asleep and snoring, Jim says, "Don't it s'prise you the way dem kings carries on, Huck?" "No," I says, "it don't." "Why don't it, Huck?" "Well, it don't because it's in the breed. I reckon they're all alike. But, Huck, these kings aren't regular rapscallions, that's just what they is. They's regular rapscallions." "Well, that's what I'm a-saying. All kings is mostly rapscallions as fur as I can make out." "Is that so?" "You read about them once. You'll see. Look at Henry VIII. This'n is a Sunday school superintendent to him. And look at Charles II and Louis XIV and Louis XV and James II and Edward II and Richard III and 40 more. Besides all them Saxon heptarchies that used to rip around in old times and raise Cain. My, you ought to see old Henry VIII when he was in bloom. He was a blossom. He used to marry a new wife every day and chop off her head next morning, and he would do it just as indifferent as if he was ordering up eggs. Fetch up Nell Gwyn, he says. They fetch her up. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Fetch up Jane Shore, he says, and up she comes. Next morning, chop off her head, and they chop it off. Ring up Fair Rosamund. Fair Rosamund answers the bell. Next morning, chop off her head, and he made every one of them tell him a tale every night, and he kept that up till he had hogged 1,001 tales that way. And then he put them all in a book and called it Domesday Book, which was a good name and stated the case. You don't know kings, Jim, but I know them, and this old rip of ourn is one of the cleanest I've struck in history. Well, Henry, he takes a notion he wants to get up some trouble with this country. How does he go at it? Give notice? Give the country a show? No, all of a sudden he heaves all the tea in Boston Harbor overboard and whacks out a Declaration of Independence and dares them to come on. That was his style. He never gave anybody a chance. He had suspicions of his father, the Duke of Wellington. Well, what did he do? Ask him to show up? No. Drowned him in a butt of Mamsie like a cat. Suppose people left money laying around where he was. What did he do? He collared it. Suppose he contracted to do a thing and you paid him and didn't set down there and see that he'd done it. What did he do? He always done the other thing. Suppose he opened his mouth, what then? If he didn't shut it up powerful quick, he'd lose a lie every time. That's the kind of a bug Henry was. And if we'd 'a' had him along 'stead of our kings, he'd 'a' fooled that town a heap worse than ourn done. I don't say that ourn is lambs because they ain't, when you come right down to the cold facts, but they ain't nothing to that old ram anyway. All I say is kings, and you gotta make allowances. Take them all around. They're a mighty ornery lot. It's the way they're raised. But this one do smell so like the nation, Huck. Well, they all do, Jim. We can't help the way a king smells. History don't tell no way. Now the Duke, he is a tolerable likely man in some ways. Yes, a Duke's different, but not very different. This one's a middling hard lot for a Duke. When he's drunk, there ain't no nearsighted man could tell him from a king. Well, anyways, I don't hanker for no more'n them, Huck. These is all I can stand. It's the way I feel too, Jim. But we've got them on our hands, and we gotta remember what they are and make allowances. Sometimes I wish we could hear of a country that's out of kings. What was the use to tell Jim these weren't real kings and dukes? It wouldn't have done no good. And besides, it was just as I said. You couldn't tell them from the real kind. I went to sleep, and Jim didn't call me when it was my turn. He often done that. When I waked up just at daybreak, he was sitting there with his head down betwixt his knees, moaning and mourning to himself. I didn't take notice nor let on. I knowed what it was about. He was thinking about his wife and his children away up yonder, and he was low and homesick because he hadn't ever been away from home before in his life. And I do believe he cared just as much for his people as white folks does for their'n. It don't seem natural, but I reckon it's so. He was often moaning and mourning that way nights when he judged I was asleep and saying, "Poor little Elizabeth, po' little Johnny, it's mighty hard. I speck I ain't ever going to see you no mo', no mo'." He was a mighty good servant, Jim was. But this time I somehow got to talking to him about his wife and young ones, and by he says, "What makes me feel so bad this time is because I hear something over yonder on the bank like a whack, or a slam, while ago, and it mind me er the time I treat my little Elizabeth so ornery. She weren't only 'bout for a year old, and she tuck in the scarlet fever, and had a powerful rough spell, but she got well, and one day she was a-standin' around, and I says to her, I says, 'Shit to do.' She never done it, just stood there, kinda smilin' up at me. It make me mad, and I says again, mighty loud, I says, 'Don't you hear me? Shit to do.' She just stood the same way, kinda smilin' up. I was a-billin'. I says, 'I lay I make you mine.' And wid dat I fetch her a slap side the head dat sent her sprawlin'. Then I went into the other room and was gone 'bout 10 minutes. And when I come back, dat was dat a-standin' open yet, and dat child standin' most right in it, a-lookin' down and mournin' and the tears runnin' down. My, but I was mad. I was a-goin' for the child, but this den, it was a-do dat open innards. Just then, long come to win and slap it too, behind the child kerblam, and my land the child never move. My breath most hop out of me, and I feel so, I don't know how I feel. I crope out all a-tremblin' and crope around and open the doors easy and slow, and poke my head in behind the child soft and still, and all of a sudden I says, 'Pow!' just as loud as I could yell. She never budge. Oh, Huck, I bust out a-cryin' and grab her up in my arms and say, 'Oh, the po' little thing. The Lord God Almighty forgive po' old Jim, 'cause he never going to forgive himself as long as he live.' Oh, she was plumb deef and dumb, Huck, plumb deef and dumb, and I been a-treatin' her so." Thank you for joining Bite at a Time Books today, while we read a bite of one of your favorite classics. Again, my name is Bree Carlile, and I hope you come back tomorrow for the next bite of Adventures of Huckleberry Finn. Don't forget to sign up for our newsletter at biteatatimebooks.com and check out the shop. You can check out the show notes or our website, biteatatimebooks.com, for the rest of the links for our show. We'd love to hear from you on social media as well.